The night of October 14th, 1983, began like any other in the quiet town of Riverbend. The sun slipped behind the low hills surrounding the town, painting the sky in dull shades of orange and gray. Porch lights flicked on one by one, and the familiar sounds of evening filled the air. Distant televisions, barking dogs, the low hum of cars passing on the main road. Nothing about the night suggested it would become the most talked-about moment in Riverbend's history. Laura Mitchell arrived home just before 9 p.m. She lived alone in a small rented house near the old railway line, a place many people avoided after dark. The house was modest but neat, with white curtains in the windows and a small garden she tried her best to keep alive. Laura was 26 years old, worked as a librarian at the local school, and was known for her calm nature. She wasn't the kind of person who caused trouble or attracted attention. To most people, she blended into the background of town life. Earlier that evening, Laura had stayed late at work organizing old records in the library storage room. She told a co-worker she felt tired and planned to make dinner and go to bed early. Nothing unusual. No signs of Faye. No mention of meeting anyone. Neighbors later told police they saw a lights turn on around 9:15 p.m. One neighbor noticed her standing in the kitchen, moving slowly as if lost in thought. Another remembered hearing soft music playing through an open window. These small details would later be repeated countless times, as if they held some hidden meaning. But at the time, they meant nothing. Around 11:30 p.m., the quiet of the neighborhood shifted. A sharp, angry voice echoed briefly through the night. Words were spoken, but no one could remember exactly what was said. It sounded like an argument, but arguments weren't rare. People fought, made up, and moved on. No doors slammed. No glass shattered. Nothing dramatic enough to make someone step outside. Then came the scream. It was short, high, and sudden. One sound, cut off almost instantly. Some neighbors heard it and froze. Others thought it was a nightmare or a television sound. One woman later admitted she pulled her blanket closer and told herself it was none of her business. No one called the police right away. 16 minutes passed before a single phone rang at the Riverbend police station. The caller didn't give a name. He said he heard shouting near the railway houses, followed by a scream. His voice shook slightly, but he didn't stay on the line. By the time officers arrived, the street was still again. The houses looked peaceful, almost untouched. Laura Mitchell's front door was unlocked. Inside, the house felt strangely calm. The radio was still playing quietly in the living room. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter, cold to the touch. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned chairs. No broken objects. Laura lay on the kitchen floor. She had been stabbed once in the chest. The wound was deep and precise, as if the person holding the knife knew exactly where to strike. There was blood on the floor, but not as much as officers expected. The knife was gone. Police searched every room carefully. Drawers were closed. Valuables were untouched. Her purse was still on the table, cash inside. It wasn't a robbery. It didn't look like a random attack. The most disturbing detail was the lack of evidence. No fingerprints. No muddy footprints. No fibers that didn't belong. The killer had either been extremely lucky or very careful. As the news spread through Riverbend the next morning, the town woke up to shock and fear. People gathered in small groups, whispering outside grocery stores and cafes. Parents kept their children home from school. Doors that had been left open for years were suddenly locked. Everyone asked the same question. Who would want to hurt Laura Mitchell? Police interviewed neighbors one by one. They all said similar things. Laura was quiet. She kept to herself. She smiled politely but didn't talk much. She had ended a relationship the year before but never complained about it. She didn't drink much. She didn't party. She didn't argue. Her co-workers described her as kind but distant. She spent most of her free time reading or volunteering at the local animal shelter. No one could recall her ever mentioning fear or danger. As detectives stood in Laura's kitchen, Studying the spotless counters and the silent room, a troubling thought began to form. The killer didn't break in. Laura had opened the door herself. That meant she knew the person standing in front of her. The medical examiner estimated the time of death between 11:30 and 11:50 p.m. That small window would become crucial. Police tried to build a timeline, but it was full of gaps. No one had seen anyone enter or leave the house. The railway tracks nearby showed no fresh footprints. The street light outside flickered, offering only shadows. Riverbend had no experience with a crime like this. The police department was small, and most officers had spent their careers handling noise complaints and minor thefts. Now they were facing a murder with no clear path forward. By evening, reporters arrived from nearby cities. Cameras pointed at Laura's house. Headlines appeared the next day calling it a town shaken and the murder that broke Riverbend's silence. Laura's parents arrived from out of town that afternoon. Her mother collapsed when she saw the house. Her father stood silently, staring at the door, as if waiting for his daughter to walk out and explain everything. As night fell again, Riverbend felt different. The same streets, the same houses, but the safety people once felt was gone. Someone in town knew what happened that night, and someone had chosen to stay silent. That silence would last for 40 years. In the weeks following Laura Mitchell's funeral, Riverbend felt trapped between grief and fear. The shock of her death had not faded. Instead, it settled into daily life like a heavy fog. People spoke in low voices. Curtains were kept closed at night. Every unfamiliar sound felt threatening. The police presence in town increased, but comfort did not. Everyone wanted answers, and no one had them. Detectives began working the case with urgency, knowing that time was their enemy. They started where all investigations begin, with the people closest to the victim. Laura's life was taken apart piece by piece, her routines examined, her relationships questioned, her past slowly uncovered. At first, the process felt hopeful. Leads appeared, names were written down, and interviews filled notebooks. But hope soon turned into frustration. The first person police focused on was Daniel Brooks, Laura's former boyfriend. They had dated for almost 2 years before separating in late 1982. Friends said the relationship ended quietly, but police learned it wasn't as peaceful as it appeared. There had been arguments, mostly about Daniel's jealousy. He didn't like how independent Laura was, or how she preferred spending time alone. Still, no one reported violence between them. Daniel was questioned for hours. He admitted he still thought about Laura and regretted how things ended. On the night of the murder, he claimed he was visiting a friend in a nearby town. That friend confirmed Daniel had been there earlier in the evening, but couldn't say exactly when Daniel left. The timeline was blurry, and police pushed hard, but without physical evidence, they couldn't hold him. Daniel walked out of the station a free man, though the suspicion followed him everywhere he went. Next, police turned their attention to Frank Holloway, a railway worker who lived only 2 houses away from Laura. Frank was known in Riverbend for his short temper and rough behavior. He had been arrested years earlier for assault during a bar fight. Several neighbors told police they had seen Frank outside that night, smoking near the tracks. One witness claimed Frank looked angry, pacing back and forth. When questioned, Frank didn't help his own case. He was defensive, aggressive, and clearly uncomfortable. But once again, an alibi stood in the way. 2 co-workers confirmed he had been at a late-night maintenance job along the railway after 11 p.m. Police tried to break that story, but it held. No matter how much Frank seemed like the kind of man capable of violence, there was nothing tying him to Laura's death. As days passed, detectives began expanding their search. Co-workers, old friends, distant relatives, even people who had borrowed books from the library were interviewed. Each conversation ended the same way. No threats, no strange behavior, no obvious motive. The lack of forced entry continued to haunt investigators. Whoever killed Laura didn't sneak in. She had let them inside. That narrowed the list, but not enough. It suggested trust, or at least familiarity. But Laura was private. She didn't talk about her personal life much. If she had secrets, she kept them well hidden. Rumors filled the silence left by facts. Some people believed Laura was involved in a secret relationship with a married man. Others whispered about something she might have discovered at the library, old documents or hidden information that someone wanted buried. A few even suggested she was planning to leave town, and someone didn't want her to go. Police followed these rumors carefully, but each one collapsed under scrutiny. No secret lover. No missing files. No sign that Laura was preparing to dissipate. The more detectives searched, the less they seemed to find. The case began to affect the investigators themselves. Long hours and dead ends took their toll. Files stacked up. The same photographs were studied again and again, hoping a missed detail would suddenly stand out. But the crime scene remained clean, almost intentionally so. One detail continued to trouble them. The single stab wound. It wasn't random or emotional. It was controlled. That suggested the killer either had experience or had rehearsed the act in their mind. But who in Riverbend fit that description? By early winter, pressure from the public grew stronger. Town meetings were filled with anger and fear. Parents demanded answers. Local newspapers criticized the police for failing to protect the community. Detectives felt the weight of every unanswered question. Then, just as frustration reached its peak, a new lead appeared. An elderly woman came forward, claiming she saw a young man near Laura's house around 11 p.m. on the night of the murder. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she remembered his posture and the way he walked quickly toward the railway tracks. This witness account shifted the focus again. Police revisited old interviews, searching for anyone who matched the vague description. But time had already begun to erode memories. Details blurred. Dates became uncertain. What felt clear one week felt doubtful the next. As months passed, Riverbend slowly tried to return to normal. Life had to continue, even with fear lingering in the background. But the investigation lost momentum. New cases demanded attention. Resources were limited. By the end of the first year, the suspects had all but vanished from daily discussion. Daniel Brooks moved to another town. Frank Holloway kept his head down and avoided attention. Others connected to Laura faded into the background of life. Laura's parents refused to let the case die. They called the police regularly, asking for updates, pushing for progress. Each time, the answers were the same. No new evidence. No new leads. 5 years passed. The detectives who once worked the case retired or transferred. New officers skimmed the old files but found nothing their predecessors hadn't already seen. The evidence, once fresh, now felt like a relic from another time. By the early 1990s, the murder of Laura Mitchell was officially labeled a cold case. Riverbend rarely spoke of it anymore, but the memory remained just below the surface. People still glanced at the old railway houses when they passed by. Parents still warned their children to be careful, even if they didn't explain why. And somewhere beyond the town, the person responsible lived on, untouched by suspicion, as the truth slowly slipped further into the shadows of time. Nearly 4 decades after Laura Mitchell was buried, her name returned to the surface of Riverbend in a way no one expected. Time had changed the town. Old shops were gone, replaced by newer buildings. Many of the people who remembered Laura had moved away or passed on. To younger residents, the murder was nothing more than a rumor from the past, a story their parents mentioned only when warning them about the railway houses. In 2019, Detective Maya Collins sat in a quiet office miles away, flipping through digitized records of unsolved cases. She worked in a newly formed cold case unit, created to re-examine crimes that had been forgotten, not because they were unimportant, but because the tools to solve them hadn't existed before. Maya had built her reputation on patience. She believed that most unsolved crimes were not mysteries at all, just puzzles waiting for the right moment. Laura Mitchell's file stood out almost immediately. It wasn't just the lack of evidence that caught Maya's attention. It was the feeling that something had been deliberately erased. The crime scene photograph showed order, not chaos. The reports described a house untouched by panic. To Maya, it felt less like a crime of sudden anger and more like a moment carefully controlled. She requested the physical evidence to be transferred for review. Boxes arrived weeks later, covered in dust and old labels. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten notes, sealed envelopes, and items that had once been considered useless. Among them was a blood-stained dish towel recovered from Laura's kitchen. In the 1980s, testing had been limited. Investigators concluded it belonged to Laura and moved on. Maya sent the towel for modern DNA analysis. While she waited for results, she read every interview transcript. She noticed patterns others had missed. People described Laura as private, but several mentioned she had seemed distracted in the weeks before her death. One co-worker recalled Laura asking strange questions about security at the school library. Another remembered her leaving work early one afternoon, visibly upset, but refusing to explain why. Maya began to feel that Laura had been afraid. When the lab results came back, they confirmed Laura's DNA was present on the towel. But there was something else too. A second DNA profile, faint but real. Maya felt a surge of excitement mixed with caution. A second profile didn't automatically mean a killer. It could belong to anyone who had touched the towel. Still, after 40 years of nothing, it was more than the case had ever had. She ran the DNA through the national database. No match. For a moment, it felt like the case had slipped away again. But Maya wasn't ready to stop. She turned to genetic genealogy, a newer method that used public DNA databases to build family connections. It was slow work, requiring patience and careful analysis. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, branches of a family tree began to form. Names appeared. Locations connected. One surname surfaced repeatedly, growing closer to the center of the tree with every new connection. Brooks. Maya's breath caught. Daniel Brooks. Laura's former boyfriend. The man questioned in the original investigation. The DNA suggested a close family relationship, possibly a sibling. Maya felt the weight of the moment. If Daniel had been involved, why hadn't he been charged? She pulled his file again, reading it with fresh eyes. Daniel's alibi had been weak but never broken. There had been no physical evidence linking him to the scene. Then Maya noticed something she hadn't before. Daniel Brooks had died in 2009. If the DNA belonged to him, the case was over before it began. You couldn't charge a dead man. But something didn't sit right. The DNA on the towel wasn't a perfect match to Daniel's profile stored in old records. It was close, but not exact. It suggested someone related to him. Before Maya could fully process this, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the police station in Riverbend, forwarded to Maya's unit. It had no return address. The handwriting was careful, almost nervous. Inside was a single piece of paper with one sentence written in black ink. "You're looking at the wrong Daniel." Maya read it 3 times. The letter sent a chill through her. Someone knew the case was being reopened. Someone knew about Daniel Brooks. And someone was watching closely enough to interfere. Maya contacted local police in Riverbend and requested old property records, school files, and family histories related to the Brooks family. That was when she found him. Ethan Brooks, Daniel's younger brother. In 1983, Ethan had been 17 years old. Too young to draw attention. Too quiet to be remembered. His name appeared briefly in family records and then vanished. After Daniel moved away, Ethan disappeared from Riverbend's official files entirely. No one had interviewed him. Maya couldn't understand how that had happened. But then she realized something important. In the 1980s, police rarely considered teenagers serious suspects unless they were obvious troublemakers. Ethan had no criminal record, no complaints, no reason to stand out. He had been invisible. Maya dug deeper. She found school reports describing Ethan as withdrawn and obsessive. One teacher wrote that he struggled with boundaries and became fixated on certain people. Another noted that he had difficulty handling rejection. Then Maya found something that made her heart race. A short, forgotten report filed by Laura Mitchell just weeks before her death. Laura had gone to the local police station and spoken briefly to an officer. She said a teenage boy had been following her, watching her from across the street, appearing outside the library unexpectedly. She hadn't known his name. She hadn't wanted to make a big deal out of it. The officer made a note and promised to keep an eye out. Nothing more was done. The description Laura gave matched Ethan Brooks. Maya sat back, the pieces finally beginning to connect. Laura had likely recognized Ethan. Perhaps she had confronted him. Perhaps she tried to set boundaries. And on the night of her death, she may have opened the door to someone she knew well enough not to fear immediately. The letter suddenly made sense. Someone had wanted to shift attention away from Ethan and toward Daniel. Even decades later, Maya tracked Ethan Brooks across state lines. He was living under a different last name, having legally changed it in the 1990s. He had built a stable life, a job, a family, no criminal history. To the world, he was an ordinary man. When police approached him for questioning, Ethan appeared calm. He denied remembering Laura Mitchell well, claimed he barely knew her. When asked for a DNA sample, his expression changed. He refused. That refusal echoed louder than any confession. Maya knew then that the case was no longer buried in the past. It was alive again, breathing, and dangerous. And the person responsible had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years, waiting and hoping that no one would ever look closely enough to find the truth. The moment Ethan Brooks refused to give a DNA sample, the past and present collided. What had once been an old, forgotten file was now a living case again, filled with risk, pressure, and consequences. Detective Maya Collins knew from experience that innocent people rarely refused simple requests. Fear changes people, and Ethan's calm mask had cracked just enough to reveal something underneath. Legal steps moved carefully. 40 years had passed, and every action had to be precise. A mistake could destroy the case forever. Maya worked closely with prosecutors, rebuilding the timeline piece by piece, knowing that memories faded but records did not. Every document, every forgotten note, every overlooked detail mattered now more than ever. While the request for a court-ordered DNA sample was being prepared, Maya returned to Riverbend. She wanted to see the town through Laura Mitchell's eyes, to understand how a young woman could be killed there without leaving behind a trail of answers. The railway houses still stood, older and more worn, but unchanged in shape. Laura's house was gone, replaced by an empty lot covered in dry grass. Standing there, Maya felt the weight of silence, as if the ground itself remembered what had happened. She visited the local library next. The building had been renovated, but the layout was similar. Old storage rooms still existed in the back, shelves stacked with records no one had touched in years. Maya reviewed staff logs and schedules from 1983. Laura's name appeared again and again. Neat handwriting, careful notes. She had been responsible, organized, detail-oriented. Not careless. Not reckless. Maya spoke to retired officers, some reluctant, some emotional. One of them remembered Laura's brief visit to the station to report being followed. He admitted, quietly, that the report hadn't seemed serious at the time. A teenage boy watching someone didn't feel dangerous in a town like Riverbend. Hearing that now felt like reopening an old wound. As Maya continued digging, she learned more about Ethan Brooks' life after 1983. Shortly after Laura's murder, Ethan dropped out of school. Within a year, he left town with Daniel. Records showed counseling sessions paid for by Daniel, listed vaguely as family stress. A few years later, Ethan legally changed his last name. He moved often at first, then finally settled down, building a stable life far from Riverbend. The question haunted Maya. If Daniel hadn't committed the murder, why had his DNA been found at the scene? The answer emerged slowly and painfully. Maya re-examined Daniel Brooks' old interview transcripts. In one section, Daniel mentioned visiting Laura's house months before her death to return a book. At the time, it had seemed harmless. Now it took on new meaning. If Daniel had been inside the house before, his DNA could have been present long before the murder. But there was more. A reanalysis of the dish towel revealed that Daniel's DNA was mixed with Laura's, consistent with casual contact, not violence. The second DNA profile, Ethan's, showed signs of stress transfer, suggesting it came from someone under physical or emotional pressure. Someone who had been sweating, gripping, wiping. Daniel hadn't been the killer. He had been the shield. The court order for Ethan's DNA was approved. When officers arrived at his home, Ethan didn't resist, but his confidence was gone. He avoided eye contact. His hands trembled slightly. The swab was taken, sealed, and sent for analysis. The wait that followed was tense, heavy with anticipation. When the results came back, there was no longer any doubt. The DNA matched the unknown profile from the crime scene. Ethan Brooks was arrested. During the initial interrogation, Ethan said nothing. He stayed at the table, jaw tight, eyes hollow. Hours passed in silence. Maya watched through the glass, understanding that this wasn't the behavior of a man falsely accused. This was the behavior of someone reliving something buried deep for decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. He said he never meant to kill her. Maya listened without interrupting. Ethan admitted he had become obsessed with Laura in the months before her death. She had been kind to him at the library, polite, professional. To Ethan, those small gestures grew into something larger. He followed her routines, learned her schedule, watched her from a distance. In his mind, he wasn't stalking her. He was protecting something he believed belonged to him. When Laura noticed, she became afraid. She confronted him once outside the library, telling him to leave her alone. She spoke firmly but calmly. That rejection shattered something inside him. After that, he watched more closely, not less. He convinced himself she was confused, that she didn't understand how much he cared. On the night of the murder, Ethan said he went to her house intending to explain himself. He knocked, and Laura opened the door, surprised but not panicked. She recognized him. She trusted him just enough to listen. Inside, the conversation quickly turned into an argument. Laura told him to leave. She threatened to call the police. Ethan felt his control slipping. His voice rose. His thoughts blurred. When Laura turned toward the kitchen phone, panic took over. He grabbed the nearest knife. The moment lasted seconds, but its impact lasted a lifetime. Ethan described standing there afterward, unable to move, unable to understand what he had done. The house was silent. Laura lay on the floor, motionless. Reality crashed in all at once. He called Daniel. Daniel arrived quickly. According to Ethan, his brother was horrified. Daniel hadn't known the full extent of Ethan's obsession. Faced with the sight of Laura's body and his younger brother shaking in fear, Daniel made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He helped Ethan clean up. Daniel wiped surfaces, unknowingly leaving traces of his own DNA behind. He disposed of the knife somewhere along the railway tracks. He told Ethan to leave town and never come back. Daniel stayed behind and answered police questions, carrying a secret he believed would protect his brother from destroying his life. Daniel never confessed. He lived with the guilt until his death, believing silence was the price of family loyalty. As Ethan spoke, tears streamed down his face, not for Laura, but for himself, for the life he could have had, for the years he spent hiding, for the fear that never truly left him. Maya felt no sympathy. She thought of Laura, of the future stolen from her, of the family left behind with unanswered questions. She thought of how easily this could have been prevented if that early report had been taken seriously. Ethan was formally charged with second-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Riverbend. News spread quickly, reigniting old memories and reopening old wounds. Some residents felt relief. Others felt anger that justice had taken so long. A few struggled with the realization that the killer had once been just a quiet teenager in their town. As the trial approached, Ethan's carefully built life collapsed. His family learned the truth. His children asked questions he couldn't answer. The past he thought he had buried rose up and claimed everything. For Maya, the case was nearly complete, but it left behind a bitter truth. Time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it only hides them, allowing pain to grow quietly in the dark. And after 40 years, the silence surrounding Laura Mitchell's death was finally broken. The courtroom was silent as Ethan Brooks was led inside, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his shoulders hunched under a weight that had taken 40 years to arrive. The man who entered no longer resembled the quiet teenager from old photographs. His hair was gray, his face lined with age, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. It was the same fear he had carried since the night Laura Mitchell died, hidden behind new names, new jobs, and a carefully built life. The trial began in the spring of 2023, drawing national attention. Reporters filled the benches. Cameras waited outside. For Riverbend, it felt as though time had folded in on itself. A crime once buried in whispers was now being spoken aloud in full detail. Prosecutors opened the case by reminding the jury that justice delayed was still justice deserved. They spoke of Laura Mitchell not as a victim, but as a person. A young woman who loved books, quiet mornings, and helping children learn to read. They described her final night, the trust she showed by opening her door, and the betrayal that followed. Every word felt heavy, especially to those who had known her. Detective Maya Collins took the stand early in the trial. Calm and precise, she walked the jury through the decades-long journey of the case. She explained how advances in DNA technology made it possible to hear voices that had once been silent. She described the dish towel, the genetic match, and the letter that tried to mislead the investigation. The courtroom listened closely as Maya explained how the truth had been hidden not by chance, but by choice. When the prosecution revealed that Daniel Brooks had helped cover up the crime, a murmur moved through the room. Many people had spent years suspecting Daniel, never knowing he had carried a different burden. Daniel was no longer alive to defend himself, but his actions were laid bare, not to condemn him, but to explain the long silence. Ethan's confession was presented carefully. The jury heard his words, his explanation of obsession, rejection, panic, and regret. The prosecution made one thing clear. Regret did not erase responsibility. Fear did not excuse violence. Time did not undo murder. The defense argued that Ethan had been young, emotionally unstable, and overwhelmed. They suggested the crime was a tragic mistake, not a calculated act. They emphasized the years he lived without further violence, the family he built, and the life he tried to lead. But the prosecution returned again and again to Laura, to the life that ended at 26, to the choices taken from her, to the decades of family spent without answers. Laura's younger sister, Emily, took the stand near the end of the trial. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she did not stop. She talked about birthdays Laura never reached, holidays that felt incomplete, and parents who died still waiting for justice. She looked directly at Ethan and said she had imagined this moment for most of her life, but it brought no peace, only truth. When closing arguments ended, the jury deliberated for 3 days. Riverbend waited. People gathered in homes, cafes, and church halls, watching news updates, reliving memories they thought they had buried. For older residents, it felt like reopening a wound that never truly healed. For younger ones, it was a lesson in how long shadows can last. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Guilty. Ethan Brooks showed little reaction. He closed his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging what he had always known would come. He was sentenced to decades in prison, a punishment that would likely last the rest of his life. For Laura Mitchell's family, the verdict brought a strange mix of relief and grief. Justice had arrived, but far too late to feel complete. Her parents were not there to see it. They had died believing their daughter's killer would never be found. Emily stood alone outside the courthouse afterward, holding a photograph of Laura, unsure whether to smile or cry. Riverbend changed after the trial. The town held a memorial near the old railway houses, not just for Laura, but for the truth that had been hidden for so long. People spoke openly about fear, silence, and responsibility. Retired officers admitted mistakes. Residents talked about moments they wished they had acted differently. The town faced itself honestly for the first time in decades. A small plaque was placed near the empty lot where Laura's house once stood. It did not mention the crime. It only carried her name and the years she lived. A reminder that she was more than the way she died. Detective Maya Collins returned to her work, but the case stayed with her. She often thought about how close the truth had been in 1983, and how easily it was missed. One ignored report. One assumption. One decision to look away. The difference between justice and silence had been heartbreakingly small. Ethan Brooks entered prison carrying a truth that no longer belonged only to him. His carefully constructed life was gone. The family he built had to live with his actions. His children would grow up knowing their father's past. Time, which once protected him, now worked against him. But the story did not end with his conviction. Laura Mitchell's case became a symbol for cold cases across the country. It reminded investigators and communities that unsolved crimes are not forgotten crimes. They are simply waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for courage. Waiting for someone to care enough to listen. 40 years after a single scream cut through the night, the truth finally stood in the light. Justice did not arrive quickly. It did not arrive cleanly. But it arrived. And in that long-delayed moment, Laura Mitchell's voice, silenced too soon, was finally heard.